Pokemon Red and Blue were released in the United States on September 28, 1998, which is around 2.5 years after their Japanese originals, Pokemon Red and Green, were originally released. Pokemon Yellow would be released in America a little over a year later in October of 1999. These games' release was absolutely explosive, to the point where Pokemon Red and Blue are still some of the highest selling games of all time. In hindsight, I think a lot of Pokemon Red and Blue's popularity was due to the ease of access of these games at the time. In 1998, the original Game Boy cost only around $50, which would be about double the cost today because of inflation, and Pokemon Red and Blue only cost around $30 each, according to what I could find online. For such a relatively small asking price, people in the late 90s were able to pick up one of the most versatile gaming systems of the time that they could play wherever and whenever they wanted, along with what was, for the time, one of the most ambitious games I've ever played. Later entries have definitely eclipsed the original in terms of objective quality, but I don't think it's fair to say that Pokemon Red and Blue are inherently bad games just because Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green exist. When judging them on their own in the context of their time, Pokemon Red and Blue are great games. That doesn't mean they don't have problems, though. People online have talked about this game's problems to death, but to put it quickly, the problems with game balancing, glitches and bugs, a wide range of quality in terms of Pokemon designs, a lackluster story, and repetitive gameplay were all omnipresent throughout the entire experience, to the point where playing these games without emulator speed-up tool feels actively torturous. However, most of these problems aren't nearly as bad as some people online would like you to think, and if you can put those problems aside, I hope you'll be able to see why Pokemon Red and Blue provides such a solid foundation for the juggernaut of a series that Pokemon would become. Before we get into the actual game, though, I do want to explain my choice to play Pokemon Red for this critique rather than Pokemon Yellow, since the latter is the enhanced re-release that I'll be playing for every other generation. The primary reason I'm doing this is because Yellow is fundamentally different from every other enhanced edition that would come out later, as it forces you to use Pikachu as a starter and, from what I can tell, doesn't allow you to take it out of your party. The only other mainline games in the series that do this are the Let's Go games, and I think that this idea could be used to some good effect. I quite like the Let's Go games, even if they're very simple, but my personal favorite aspects of these games is the team building aspect, and how said freedom and how you construct your team can provide a vastly different experience every time you replay these games. I'm not a huge fan of restricting these choices, so to facilitate that, I'm going to be playing Pokemon Red for this review. The only other time in the series that I plan on actively choosing the original release over the enhanced re-release is when we get to Pokemon Sun and Moon, which I'll talk about more when we get there. Now that I've justified my play choice, let's dive into the world of Pokemon. Pokemon Red starts off in a very simple manner that allows the player to jump right into the meat of the game almost immediately. It's so fast that, after naming your character and your rival, you can be let loose into the world within 5 minutes, and that's a high estimate. It's not perfect, since the game makes you grab Oak's parcel in Viridian City and go back through Route 1 again just to get a Pokedex or ride to Progress, but compared to later entries, you're able to actually begin playing the game much faster, and that's something I really appreciate. I think a big part of the philosophy that Game Freak had when designing these first two games was with their hardware in mind, imagining that people playing this game would be doing so in between classes or meetings, or while they're on the subway or riding as a passenger in someone's car. Because of that, this game is designed to be played in short bursts, which is even better exemplified by the gym system. To beat Pokemon Red, you need to collect 8 badges and then beat the Elite Foreign Champion at the Pokemon League, and the process of getting those badges is relatively quick. In the playthrough I did for this video, it only took me about an hour to progress all the way to defeating Brock, and that's with going out of my way to catch another Pokemon and train it up, along with doing the optional rival fight outside the Pokemon League. After getting my first badge, I was able to pause the game, watch some YouTube, write this part of the script, get some dinner, go to sleep, wake up, and then I went ahead and hopped back into the game to grab my second badge from Misty. Playing the game for long amounts of time can get a bit monotonous, but I don't think it was intended to be played for hours at a time, and by playing it in short bursts like this, a lot of the problems in this game aren't nearly as omnipresent as they may seem at first. But I've been getting way too ahead of myself with this part of the script. Like my previous video, I want to try and go through this game point by point in terms of progression in order to point out strengths and weaknesses when they come up. So with that in mind, let's return back to Pallet Town and pick out our first Pokemon. Even if I like other starter trios from later in the series a lot more, it's honestly hard to say much against the Gen 1 starters. What's even better is how, especially compared to every other game in the series, these 3 starters act essentially as difficulty options for the early game. Given that the first 2 gyms in this game, which are the only ones required to be done in that order, are Rock and Water type respectively, Bulbasaur instantly becomes a powerful option because it does so well against both of them. Squirtle is able to take on Brock pretty well and resists Misty's water attacks, and his normal type attack are good enough neutral damage to win the day. And Charmander, while not that great against the first two gyms, does have a good matchup against Erica and Blaine, does well against Lorelei in the Elite Four, and is really good against the many grass and bug types in the early game. There really isn't a bad option here, something that will definitely not be true for Generation 2. There are only two things I don't like about this starter choice. The first is how Bulbasaur works differently from the other two. Charmander and Squirtle get Ember at level 9 and Bubble at level 8 respectively, while Bulbasaur gets Leech Seed at level 8 in this game, which is a status move that's good for damage over time, but doesn't allow Bulbasaur to tap into its full power until level 14 when it learns Vine Whip. I originally thought this was really bad in terms of game design for it to take so long for Bulbasaur to learn a same type attack bonus move, but Brock's Onix is also level 14, which is still a bit high for the early game in my opinion. And for Bulbasaur in particular, if you're using more than just him for the early game, you're probably going to have to grind. Not for too long, but it'll still be necessary if you don't want to be banging your starter's head against a rock for 20 turns. Squirtle doesn't have this problem since you can beat Brock while relatively underleveled, since Squirtle gets Bubble so early on. And Charmander can't do anything against Brock or Misty, which encourages the player to catch other Pokemon to make up for their Pokemon's weaknesses. Yet that's also a problem, because in Red and Blue specifically, picking Charmander is objectively the worst option, because none of the Pokemon available before the first gym have moves that are even able to hit Brock's Pokemon for neutral damage. Thankfully they changed this in Yellow and the remakes by adding Mankey to the route west of Viridian City, but for these first two games it's a sore oversight. Aside from those two flaws though, I think this starter choice is relatively balanced in the long run. The first rival battle isn't going to be too important in any of these games, but something that I do want to point out here is that you're able to legitimately lose this fight. In several future games, mainly Gen 4 and onward if I remember correctly, your rival can get you into red health range before just spamming status moves until you win. This first fight doesn't do that, and it actually rewards the player if they picked up the free potion in the PC at the beginning of the game. For being a relatively boring starting fight, there's a surprising amount of thought that goes into it from a game design perspective. Route 1 isn't too much to write home about, but it's good for new players to get to know how the main gameplay loop works, along with Viridian Forest soon after. Going from town to town, encountering and sometimes catching wild Pokemon, battling trainers, then challenging the local gym when you're powerful enough. This is the gameplay loop that every Pokemon game uses, except for maybe Scarlet and Violet depending on how you view their non-linearity, and I think that Gen 1 introduces this gameplay loop in a simple yet satisfying way. The only blight on this opening section, in my opinion, is having to deliver Oak's parcel back to him. It really kills the pacing of the beginning, especially having to go back through Route 1 again with however many random encounters you get into, but aside from that, the opening to Gen 1 is really good in my opinion. Once you get to Viridian City after delivering Oak's parcel, you have the choice to either go west toward Route 22, or north toward Route 2 in Viridian Forest. There isn't much for the player on Route 22 aside from a few new Pokemon and an optional rival fight, the latter of which is a bit too high level for this point in the game in my opinion. By this point, if you immediately go to Route 22 upon reaching Viridian City, your starter is likely level 7 at most, and with Blue's Pokemon being level 9 and 8 respectively, it's really difficult to win this fight. This may encourage the player to catch more Pokemon early on, but if so, I think that's communicated poorly. Also, for some reason, Gust is a normal type attack in these games, which is really weird to me and I really don't like it, but that's just a nitpick. Moving on to Viridian Forest, this is a really good first dungeon to get the player used to the gameplay loop. There are a few trainers here, several optional paths with items at the end, and a relatively simple main path if you want to get through quickly. Most of the encounters here aren't that great, although Caterpie and Weedle are great for showing the player how evolution works, and Pikachu, despite how oversaturated he is a really good secondary Pokemon for the early game and can be a really good help against Misty, especially if you're using Squirtle or Charmander. Once you make it to Pewter City, you're gated from moving on before beating the gym, but I think that's okay, since the trainers beyond this area would probably be a bit too strong for the player at this point in their journey. Going into the Pewter Gym, it is very simple, literally just a straight line with one trainer, in Brock. The later gyms will be more complex, but I do think that this one could have been a bit better with some non-HM equivalent strength puzzles perhaps. Brock himself is an incredibly easy fight, but for this being the first gym in the first game in the series, I think that's okay. It's a little bit weird that his team, despite being entirely Rock-type, doesn't have a single Rock-type move, something that would be fixed in Fire Red and Leaf Green, so maybe Charmander isn't as useless here as I may have originally thought, but Onix's Bide move can be good for teaching players the importance of status moves, even if it only really teaches them to use them for stall tactics, which I'm not a huge fan of. One thing that I do think is a little weird in this game, and something that reappears in Gens 2 and 3, is that obtaining gym badges in these first 3 generations actually increases Pokemon stats. I'll go ahead and go in depth on this here instead of bringing it up in each of these generations, so to outline this, The Boulder Badge, Zephyr Badge, and Stone Badge each increase attack. The Thunder Badge, Mineral Badge, and Balance Badge each increase defense. The Volcano Badge, Glacier Badge, and Mine Badge each increase special attack and special defense, or just a special stat in Gen 1. And the Soul Badge, Plane Badge, and Dynamo Badge each increase speed. It's a really weird feature that I find to be unnecessary overall, and I don't think the games from Gen 4 onward are better or worse for its removal, but I thought it was still worth mentioning. Now we can move on through Mount Moon, Nugget Bridge, and finally through the Cerulean City Gym. Starting from Route 3, there are several trainers to battle on the way to Mount Moon, along with a few new Pokemon that aren't much to write home about in my opinion. The big thing to point out before heading into Mount Moon is that this is the first opportunity the player gets to obtain a Magikarp, which evolves into Gyarados starting at level 20. I'm not exaggerating in any way when I say that Gyarados in Generation 1 might be the most overpowered Pokemon in the entire series. That opinion might change as we get further on into this little video series, but for now, I want to defend that statement real quick. Skipping a bit ahead to the end of my playthrough, I was able to solo the final 2 rival battles, including the champion fight, using only Gyarados because his stats are so insane, and I was 10 levels below his weakest Pokemon in that final fight. There are several factors that make Gyarados so powerful, factors I'll go more in depth on later in the video, but here's a quick list of them to get my current point across. 1. Gyarados' type of water flying only has 2 weaknesses, Rock and Electric. The former is a physical type that in theory would be dangerous for Gyarados, but because all rock types in Gen 1 are also ground type, and all of them are slower than Gyarados, and all of them have an awful special stat, Gyarados is basically guaranteed to go first and one-shot them before they can do anything. Electric faces a completely different problem. There just aren't that many good electric types in Gen 1. To qualify, yes, there are several good electric types in these games, such as Raichu, Electabuzz, Magneton, and of course Zapdos, but the problem is, after fighting Lieutenant Surge at the Vermilion Gym, there really aren't any major battles that use electric-type Pokemon or moves. Number 2, Gyarados has a base 125 attack stat and a base 100 special stat. Having a base attack stat of 125 is insane for this early in the series. Later entries will make this look small, just look at Fluttermane, Jesus Christ. Putting Gyarados as having the 3rd highest attack stat in the game, only behind Dragonite at 134, and the 4-way tie between Flareon, Rhydon, Machamp, and Kingler. And if we factor in their overall base stat totals and how those attack stats are to those individual Pokemon, Gyarados is second only to Dragonite, who is only used by one trainer in the game, and is quad weak to Ice, which, surprise, Gyarados can exploit by using Ice Beam, and that's not even mentioning how overpowered Hyper Beam is on this thing. We'll talk more about the special stat as a whole when we talk about the Psychic type later, but with a base 100 special stat, Gyarados is tied for the 9th highest special stat in the game, and with moves like Surf, Hydro Pump, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, Thunder, and even fucking Fire Blast, Gyarados is an offensive beast that barely takes any damage. It might seem like I see this as a problem with the game's design, but honestly, I kind of like how Gyarados is so overpowered. It rewards the player immensely for sticking with Magikarp Switch training for 15 levels, and dear lord, that period of Switch training is awful to slog through. And it continues to pull its weight for the entire rest of the playthrough, to the point that the Gyarados I used on my team, aptly named Godslayer, was easily the MVP of my team with very little competition. The only Pokemon that can come close to even rivaling Gyarados' objective superiority in this game is Mewtwo, but since Mewtwo is locked to the post-game in Cerulean Cave, Gyarados rules the Kanto region nearly uncontested. Speaking of Cerulean Cave, the town just outside it is our next destination, just past Mount Moon, so I think it's time we finally talk about the cave before us. Mount Moon is a good follow-up to Viridian Forest in terms of dungeon design, but I do think it also shows one of the worst parts of not just this game, but the entire series. To put it simply, the encounter rate in caves is just too damn high. There's a reason that Zubat is one of the most hated Pokemon of all time. Not because it's a bad Pokemon, although Zubat on its own is pretty bad as well, but because it does nothing but waste your fucking time. This can be mitigated by using repels obviously, but I think that's more of a band-aid solution rather than actually addressing the problem. There were several instances in both this cave and every other cave in this game where I got into an encounter, and then literally 3 steps later I was thrown into another one. I try not to use speed up on my emulator too much while playing through these games, mainly Gen 1, I used it a lot when playing through the remakes, mainly because I think it takes away from the intended experience, but the few times I did were mostly in these caves whenever I had to backtrack through them, and during a few tedious battle sequences. Mount Moon in particular is really bad about this since the swarm of Team Rocket grunts here have Pokemon that, for this point in the game, are so high leveled and have such high base stats for this point in the game, that there's a good chance you're going to wipe here and get sent back to the Pokemon Center outside. In particular, there's one grunt that has a level 16 Raticate, which aside from the fact that Rattata only evolves starting at level 20, also has the move Hyper Fang, which combined with its speed, does insane damage for this point in the game. I lost to this guy twice in this playthrough before finally beating him, meaning I had to trek all the way through Mount Moon 3 times just to beat him, and I ended up having to go through it a 4th time after that because my team was so weak after that fight that the next rocket fight finished me off. This is one of the lowest points of the game for me, and while not the worst part in my opinion, we'll get to that later, it does show how this game can be very unforgiving in a way that isn't really fun. I will admit a lot of this is on me for not buying a lot of potions and stuff, but I still think that it's a little bit too much. The only other things worth mentioning about Mount Moon are the first available Moonstone, which allows you to get either an early Nidoking, Nidoqueen, or Clefable, all of which are insanely powerful for this early in the game, and the fossil you get at the end that you won't be able to revive until several hours later. I chose the Helix fossil because I believe in the correct religion. From there, we can exit Mount Moon onto a small nothing burger of a route and enter Cerulean City, home of the second gym and a few other things we want to take notice of. You can go straight to the gym if you want, but I feel like the game intends for you to go north toward Nugget Bridge first, so that's where we're going to go for now. At the entrance to the bridge is the second rival battle, or the third if you did the one outside Victory Road before beating Brock, and it honestly isn't too much to write home about, one way or the other. Blue does mention how you should go see Bill at the end of the upcoming route and then heads out. I'll talk about Blue more as a character toward the end of the video, but for now I'll say that he's one of the better rivals in the series. Not my personal favorite, but he's a lot better compared to some of the other ones. After this is the 6-trainer gauntlet of Nugget Bridge, which would be a lot harder if I wasn't able to just go back and heal at the Pokemon Center after each battle, but I don't really count that against the game at all. It's just how I like to play these games, and if you want more of a challenge, just don't do that. The final trainer who gives you a nugget is actually a Rocket Grunt in disguise, but he doesn't really do much of anything here, and he just kind of stays there after you beat him. He's even still there after you beat Giovanni in the 8th gym when he disbands Team Rocket. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just weird, a bit of an oversight. The following route has a shitload of trainers on it, and if you count the Nugget Bridge trainers, this might be a route with the highest number of trainers on it in the game. Once you get to the end and you talk to Bill, who turns himself into a Pokemon mortar, you get the SSN ticket and then make your way back to Cerulean City, where now a cop who is standing in front of a door to a house has moved aside, allowing you to enter and see a literal hole in the wall that leads to the perpetrator, another Team Rocket Grunt, just standing in their backyard. Like, bro, you are terrible at your job, he's right fucking there, come on. You can technically head south through the underground path and over to Vermilion City and the SSN now, but you won't be able to make much progress after that point if you don't have the badge from Cerulean, so we're gonna go ahead and get that now. Misty's gym is about the same quality as Brock's in terms of layout, with it basically being a straight line with 2 trainers this time before fighting Misty herself, holy shit. Her team isn't anything to write home about, although she isn't as bad as Brock, since by this point there are several options to combat her water types, especially if you picked up a Pikachu from Viridian Forest like I did in this playthrough. Once you beat her, you get your second badge, which unlocks the ability to use the move Cut outside of battle, but we don't have the HM for that yet, and certain NPC dialogue hints that going to the SSN could help us find one, so we'll head there now. I'm going to include the SSN in this section of the video because completing it and getting the Cut HM marks a huge turning point in this game, and it would feel weird to section it off just because we already got the second badge. Plus you can technically go there before beating Misty, so it is what it is. The SSN is a cool concept, going onto a cruise liner filled with trainers that want to battle, but later games do this better, including the remakes of these games, but I think it's done well here. I do think it's a bit weird that you can just get on and off the ship as many times as you want in order to heal at the Pokemon Center. I prefer the method that the remakes use, where you're locked out of the rest of the world until you complete the ship challenge, but you have your own bedroom where you can heal whenever you want. Aside from that, there isn't too much, just another rival battle that isn't all that remarkable in my opinion. Rip Raticate though, gone but never forgotten. And you finally get the Cut HM. I'm not a huge fan of how the ship becomes inaccessible once you get the Cut HM, meaning that if you didn't fight all the trainers or get all the items, they're still inaccessible to you now. It's not a huge loss all things considered though. Now that we have access to Cut and can use it in the overworld, your immediate impulse may be to cut the nearby tree blocking off the 3rd gym, which is seen around electric types. However, and this is one of my favorite things about these games, you don't have to. It's finally time to talk about my favorite part of Pokemon Red and Blue, its freedom of progression. The comparison that I'm about to make is one that I unironically believe, and one that I will support with substantial evidence to back it up. Pokemon Red and Blue are very similar in a lot of ways to the original Dark Souls. Both are the first in their respective series, and while later entries would iterate on concepts from these games much better, the sheer amount of player freedom these games have, along with how high quality they are for their respective companies' first attempt at this, is commendable, and how every playthrough of these games is different in some way, shape, or form. Generation 1 of Pokemon and Dark Souls 1 allow for the player freedom on 2 different levels that make them both immensely replayable. Freedom on the build side and freedom on the progression side. The first is easy to compare. In Pokemon, you can have up to 6 Pokemon at a time, and those can be any combination of 6 that you want, including 6 of the same Pokemon if you really want, whether they be 6 incredibly overpowered or underpowered Pokemon, or purposely sticking to one Pokemon for added challenge. In Dark Souls, you can choose to allocate level ups to individual stats, which then determine what kinds of weapons you can wield, with dozens of different weapon classes with different scaling on several unique challenges to try them out against. On the other hand, you have the comparison of progression between Gen 1 and Dark Souls 1. In Dark Souls 1, you have to ring 2 bells for Awakening, then go to Anor Londo to obtain the Lord Vessel, then seek out the 4 Lord Souls before finally encountering Gwyn at the Kiln of the First Flame. You can go about this in several different ways. You can go the intended way through Undead Burg, up through Undead Parish, and fight the Bell Gargoyles and ring their bell first, or you can make your way down to Blighttown and fight Quelaag first to ring her Bell of Awakening. And each path has several different routes you can take to get there. With the method of getting to Blighttown, either through the Valley of Drakes using the Master Key or after completing the Depths, and being a particular standout moment of player freedom in terms of progression. You can even go to Blighttown first if you really want. And that's without even mentioning how you can get the 4 Lord Souls in any order, and that there's an entire DLC that you can access at any time during this point as well if you take the Lord Vessel. This might sound like a lot for a little Game Boy RPG to live up to, and yet I think Pokemon Red and Blue do on multiple levels. Once you beat Misty and get the Cut-A gem, you can fight Erica, Sabrina, Koga, Blaine, and even Lieutenant Surge in any order you want, as long as you beat Koga before Blaine, since you need his badge to use Surf. Either way, you're going to have to go through Rock Tunnel, which is the only area in the game that needs the Flash HMC properly, but even so, you don't have to use Flash. You can feel your way around the Dark Cave, and while it may be significantly more frustrating, you can still do it. There isn't even much of a progression barrier to get Flash. You just need to go through Diglett's Cave and have caught at least 10 Pokemon and boom, you can use Flash outside of battle instantly. Once you get to Lavender Town, the game truly opens up completely, as you can either go through Pokemon Tower, though you'll have to come back later, or you can make your way to Celadon, where you can go through the Rocket Hideout and get the Sylph Scope, take that back to Pokemon Tower, and finish it to get the Poke Flute, which you can then use to wake up Snorlax, and then either go through Route 12, 13, 14, and 15, which is the longest gauntlet in the game, or you can go down Cycling Road, which is significantly faster. Importantly, doing one of these doesn't lock you out of the other. From there you can defeat Koga, who will be a challenge at this point in the game, since you'll likely be several levels under him, and you can use Surf and the world opens up even more. And while it seemed like you may not be able to get to Cinnabar without using the Strength 8 gem that you can use after beating Erica, you can make your way all the way back to Pallet Town and surf south to get there instead. You can also go back to just outside Rock Tunnel and use Surf to reach the Power Plant, an optional dungeon that has Zapdos at the end of it. Think about that. If you know what you're doing, you can catch a legendary Pokemon, and probably the best one in the game that isn't Mewtwo, with only 3 badges to your name. You can sprinkle progression in this exploration segment by fighting a couple gym leaders if you want, but you don't have to. And that's what makes this part of the game so wonderful. I have individual things to criticize about a lot of these areas, which I'll get to later, but the fact that you have so much freedom to tackle the game in any order you want, with whatever Pokemon you want, is incredible. And its gradual removal from the series might be the most disappointing thing about future entries. To qualify that statement, though, linearity isn't necessarily a bad thing, and likewise, player freedom isn't always a good thing. We'll get to that when we talk about Scarlet and Violet. But I think that both Pokemon and Dark Souls as series do both very well, with Red and Blue having similar levels of player freedom to Dark Souls 1, while Black and White have a pristine difficulty curve and immaculate design core experience similar to Dark Souls 3. But in the end, the overall point I'm trying to make with this comparison is this. The best part about Pokemon Red and Blue is the sheer amount of player freedom it allows without compromising on it whatsoever. Honest to God, if Pokemon Red and Blue were made for the first time today with Game Freak's current design philosophy in mind, I could see a version of these games that's much more linear, and in turn, much more boring. Oh wait, that game already exists. It's called Pokemon X and Y. The Vermilion City Gym is short and unsweet. There are 3 trainers and then Lieutenant Surge, and then of course there's the infamous trash can puzzle. I have no clue what sifting through trash has to do with electricity, and the random nature of it all can be very frustrating. The only saving grace of this quote-unquote puzzle is that once you find the first switch, the second switch is guaranteed to be in one of the adjacent trash cans, meaning you have anywhere from a 25 to 50% chance to get the second switch depending on where the first switch was. It's a dumb puzzle and leaves an overall bad taste in my mouth for this gym as a whole. Lieutenant Surge isn't a very hard fight in my opinion. Compared to Misty, he only has 1 extra Pokemon, and only one of his 3 Pokemon are a higher level than any of Misty's. Fighting this Raichu early on in the game can be pretty difficult, but I do think it's a pretty smart design choice to have Diglett's Cave, where the only Pokemon encounters are Diglett and Dugtrio, are right next to Vermilion. And if you find a Dugtrio, it's guaranteed to be at least level 29, which is 5 levels higher than Surge's Raichu. Plus, his Raichu only has electric-type attacking moves, so he literally can't do anything if you bring a Diglett or a Dugtrio. His Voltorb and Pikachu do have normal-type attacks, so the fight isn't entirely free, but it's still pretty easy overall. Beating Surge allows you to use Fly out of battle, something I wasn't fully aware of for a while, which did kind of bite me in the ass while playing through Fire Red. But with how interconnected Kanto is, I think you can skip him without much issue. From this point, you now have access to the HM Cut, allowing you to explore new parts of areas you've been to before. The intended path, though, and the one you'll be taking regardless of whether or not you skip Surge, will be through Rock Tunnel. Rock Tunnel is a dungeon that I'm kind of lukewarm on. The cave itself isn't very complex and has a mostly straightforward layout. However, the main gimmick here is that the cave is dark and requires HM Flash in order to see properly. The only way to get Flash is to go through Diglett's Cave back to Pewter City, and then talk to Professor Oak's assistants, who will give it to you if you caught at least 10 different Pokemon species. This isn't too bad of a requirement, and by this point in the game, most players will have a full team of 6, and might have even evolved a few of their Pokemon, so getting that number in your Pokedex isn't too tedious. You can just go catch a couple of Rattata and Pidgeys or whatever. The key thing about this, though, is that you're not forced to get Flash in order to get through the cave. If you want to, you can just charge forward in the dark to get through, encountering trainers and wild Pokemon along the way. Lots of speedrunners and people who know the game really well do this, and the fact that the game allows you to do this at all is commendable. Along with this being the only place in the game where Flash is necessary, it makes me like this dungeon that would otherwise be pretty basic with nothing to write home about. Once you get through Rock Tunnel, you're planted right outside Lavender Town, which is probably the most infamous location in the entire series. Putting aside the urban legends that surround this place in the real world, Lavender Town is a very memorable location for its atmosphere and world building, even despite not having a gym. The main attraction here is the Pokemon Tower, where dead Pokemon from throughout Kanto are buried. You have your 4th mandatory battle with your rival here in an event that made several people on the internet think that Eradicate died and that you, the player, are the murderer. Regardless of whether that's true or not, I personally don't think it is. I doubt Pokemon would ever go that dark in the main series games. The fact that a theory like that has any sort of plausibility in the context of this game speaks to the atmosphere of this area. Pokemon Tower as a whole isn't that complex. Every trainer uses the same 2 Pokemon, Gastly and Haunter, over and over again, which does get a bit monotonous after a while. Plus, they're all allegedly possessed by ghosts, yet this plotline doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe I'm just not understanding it right, but the Ghost of Marowak doesn't really have a reason to want to possess all of these channels all of a sudden, even though they're the ones who take care of the dead spirits every day, while it just leaves Team Rocket alone while they're harassing Mr. Fuji. Unless I'm missing something, which is entirely possible, I do sometimes skim through the dialogue of these early games, I do think this is a bit of a plot hole for this part of the story. There's also a healing panel in the middle of this dungeon that I honestly don't think is necessary. The only other dungeon in this game where there's a healing point is in Silphco, which is absolutely warranted in my opinion, while here, it's nice, but it's a little unnecessary. Once you make it to the top, you'll be stopped by the Ghost of Marowak and forced to retreat from the tower. There is a glitch you can do where you use a Pokeball to skip this encounter in order to sequence break the game and get the Pokeflute early, which I doubt was intentional considering they fixed that in the remakes. You can tell I'm writing this part after I finish the remake since I'm actually referencing them now. For now, we'll head west to Celadon in order to go through the Rocket Hideout and 4th Gym. We'll start this section off with the Celadon Gym since it's quite short and unremarkable. For that, I do want to quickly mention the Celadon department store, as this is a great one-stop shop to get almost everything you need for the entire game, including easy access to all 4 evolution stones and access to vending machines at the top that can get you into Saffron City. I'm really happy that this is here, and given how many stone evolutions are in Red and Blue, this is the only department store in the series that I consistently make a point to visit during each playthrough. I really appreciate its existence. Back to the gym, it's themed around grass-type Pokemon, and its central gimmick is that all the trainers are women. Since it was before the player was allowed to choose their gender, there isn't really anything remarkable about this gym, although I do believe the remakes have unique dialogue if you choose to play as a girl. Erika herself is pretty unremarkable despite being significantly stronger than Surge. If you complete both the Rocket Hideout and Pokemon Tower before going to fight her, you'll definitely be overleveled for this fight, and if you have a Fire or Flying type, or even Pokemon with moves of those types, then this fight should be smooth sailing. The status moves can be a bit annoying, but honestly, I just power through them. No paralysis is going to stop me. What I find a lot more interesting in this area is the Rocket Hideout, and by interesting, I mean tedious and boring. This is largely in part because of the floor panel puzzles present here, which are so goddamn slow that I can step on one, go take a shit, make dinner for myself, call my ex, cry for an hour, then come back and I'll still be fucking spinning. Thankfully, they fix this in the remakes, which reinforces my belief that this is a pretty good dungeon overall, with a few shortcuts and important items, all leading up to your first showdown with Giovanni. We'll talk about Giovanni as a character when we get to his gym battle, but this first battle with him is pretty unremarkable. I know it sounds like I'm saying that a lot in this video, but that's mainly because a lot of the fights in this series tend to just be, if you have a good type matchup, you win, which is why the champion fights are always the hardest in each of these games. Once you beat Giovanni, you can obtain the Sylph Scope, and oh no. Yeah, we might as well talk about this now. My biggest pet peeve with this entire game is the fact that it has a limited inventory for no good reason, and that inventory size is so small that it makes my self-esteem look huge. I'm sure that this small inventory size is due in large part due to the fact that this is a Game Boy game that's already incredibly complex, so they had to cut corners when it came to storage space on the cartridge, which led to this limited inventory. I'm not sure how true that explanation is, I literally just pulled it out of my ass, but it's what I'm gonna go with to mitigate my frustration with this system. Later games fix this issue by first separating the bag into several different sections, and then eventually saying fuck it and just giving you infinite inventory space. The biggest problem with it in this game is that key items also count toward your inventory limit, and most of them become useless after you finish their respective dungeons, such as the lift key and card key for the Rocket Hideout and Sylph Code respectively, meaning that they take up space until you manually remove them. It's really frustrating, and I am so glad that future games fix this. With the Sylph Scope in hand, we can return to Pokemon Tower to rescue Mr. Fuji from 3 whole Rocket Grunts. After that, he gives us the Poke Flute, which allows us to wake up the 2 Snorlax blocking both ways to Fuchsia City. Real quick, I do want to praise the Poke Flute and how it basically acts as an infinite use version of the Awakening item. It makes the single player part of this game much more manageable, and I also wish that there were similar equivalents for other statuses, except maybe Frozen since it's so uncommon. My only problem with this is that you can't use it outside of battle to wake up your Pokemon. You have to be in battle to secure the status on your team members, which is a little inconvenient, but I mean, it's fine, I can make that concession. Getting to Fuchsia City either via the cycling road or via the longest series of routes in the game, routes 12, 13, 14, and 15, is a really good opportunity to reward the player for being perceptive and grabbing the bicycle from Cerulean City if they want to take the quicker way to get to the 5th gym, or if they want more experience, they can go down the 4-route gauntlet. Choosing one of them also doesn't lock you out of the other, which allows the player to naturally grind against trainers on these routes until they feel properly prepared to take on their next major challenge. The 4-route gauntlet is a little too long in my opinion, but I don't think that's a bad thing because nothing is stopping the player from turning around to go to a Pokemon Center at any point during that gauntlet, nor is anything stopping them from stocking up on potions and revives beforehand, meaning that PP is really the only limiting factor here. Once again, the freedom of how you go about getting to Fuchsia City is wonderful. We'll start off with the Safari Zone since it's required to obtain 2 HMs that are necessary to complete the game. I would be more mad about this, but there are several NPCs in and around the Safari Zone that talk about a special reward if you make it to the end, and since the Warden's gold teeth are essentially right next to the house where you get the Surf HM, and the Warden's house is clearly marked with a sign right next to the Pokemon Center, I think this one gets a pass. As for the Safari Zone itself, I think it's a nice change of pace. There are a lot of unique Pokemon here that either can't be caught anywhere else, or have much higher encounter rates than they would have if you try to find them in other locations. And those Pokemon are good. Like, really good. You have both Nidoran lines, Execute, Scyther in red and Pinsir in blue, Chansey, the best place to try and catch Dratini, and my personal favorite, Rhyhorn. The focus on pure catching is interesting, although the bait and rock options aren't really explained very much, but if you just throw balls at Pokemon, you'll get them a good percentage of the time. The RNG isn't that bad, you just gotta keep trying. The 500 Pokédollar entry fee isn't bad either, and you can get back in there really quickly once you run out of time. I think it's pretty cool. The Fuchsia City gym isn't too remarkable in my opinion. This is a poison-type gym where half the trainers use psychic types for some reason. The gimmick with this one is that there are invisible walls, but if you look closely at the floor, you can actually tell where the walls are, or alternatively, you can just bash your head against all of them until you make it to Koga. Neither is really a bad option. Koga himself is fine. He's a really big level spike coming from Airken and Surge, but that's not terrible because there are dozens of trainers and Rocket Grunts to fight prior to challenging him, including Silphco if you really want to go that far. So if you come into his fight underleveled, it's entirely your fault. On top of that, Poison is a really bad offensive type, only being super effective against grass types, half of which are also poison so they take neutral damage. Poison doesn't really become a good attacking type until Gen 6 when the Fairy type is introduced, and before that it's actively nerfed by the introduction of Steel type in Gen 2, which is outright immune to it. On top of that, Poison is weak to both Ground and Psychic, both of which are pretty widely available, including both Rhyhorn and Execute in the Safari Zone just outside the gym. I would complain about the quote-unquote intended 5th gym being so weak, but I actually think it's a good thing. Koga's Soul Badge unlocks the ability to use Surf outside of battle, which opens up even more of the world than Cut did after Misty. With Surf, you can go almost anywhere. You can go to Cinnabar Island either through the Seafoam Islands if you've also beaten Erica, or if you haven't, you can get there by going south from Pallet Town. And you can also make your way to the power plant to catch a bunch of good electric types, chief among them being Zapdos, who is probably the best Pokemon in the game beside Gyarados. Surf also opens up a whole new realm of water-type encounters that go alongside the fishing rod you can get before this point. Beating Misty and Koga are the two big moments of unlocking player freedom in this game, and I think that's absolutely incredible. Starting off with Silph Co, this is my pick for the worst part of the game. Everything about Silph Co just makes me want to turn the game off and take a fucking nap. There are 31 total battles in this place, including a rival battle and a fight with Giovanni, and there are 19 battles here which have poison types that will almost certainly inflict poison on your team, meaning that if you don't have a stockpile of full heals and antidotes, you'll have to go back and forth to either the Pokemon Center or the healing bed in this dungeon after almost every battle. The only other dungeon in this game that has a healing area inside of it is Pokemon Tower, which I didn't really think was necessary there, but it is definitely necessary here in Silph Co. In both my playthroughs of Red and Fire Red for this video, Silph Co took me over an hour to finish while fighting every trainer. And if you want to get as much experience as possible for the upcoming challenges, you'll want to fight every trainer. Given how long this place takes, the music here becomes so monotonous and ear-grating, even more so than the Lavender Town theme. It's placed right in the middle of the game too, so by the time you get to clearing this place out, it feels like such a lull in the journey. Having to slog through this place twice for this video, I never want to go through there again. And this place alone makes me actively dread returning back to Gen 1 as a whole in any capacity. Sabrina's gym isn't much better. I didn't mention this while talking about Silph Co, but there are a bunch of teleporters there that are annoying and unnecessary except to get to the rival battle in Giovanni. Here in Sabrina's gym, the entire gimmick is these teleporters, which are annoying and mandatory this time. There are 7 trainers here besides Sabrina herself, and half of them use the Ghastly Mine for some reason. Sabrina herself is also weird. She uses Kadabra, Alakazam, and Mr. Mime, yet for her 4th team member she uses Venomoth for some reason. Despite there being 2 other Psychic lines in this gym, the Hypno and Slowbro lines, the only reason Venomoth makes any sense here is because it happens to learn Psybeam. I'll save my thoughts on the Gen 1 Psychic type as a whole for a later section when I talk about the balancing this generation, so for now let's go ahead and move on to Cinnabar Island. There's a lot of stuff in and around Cinnabar Island, so we'll start by going through the Seafoam Islands from Fuchsia City. I feel like most players will take this route rather than going south from Pallet Town, simply because I don't think a lot of players will want to go back to that area for any reason at this point in the game, but maybe that's just me. The Seafoam Islands are pretty interesting, with some strength puzzles to help change the direction of the flowing water, and you can either reach the exit quickly if you just want to get to the next gym, or you can explore deeper in order to find Articuno, another legendary bird that can be really helpful. It's relatively short, but it's probably the most complex dungeon in the game that's actually fun to go through. I also felt like the encounter rate here was lower than in other caves, but that might just be due to good RNG on my part. Once you get to Cinnabar Island, you'll find that the gym is locked, and that the only way to get inside is to find the gym key inside the nearby Pokemon Mansion. Before we get into the dungeon itself, why the hell is the gym locked? And why the hell is the key at the bottom of an abandoned mansion? There are several people inside the gym. Are they just locked in there forever, hoping that someone decides to unlock it? If your rival is supposed to always be one step ahead of you, wouldn't he have found this key already and unlocked the gym? Did he throw the key away? I don't know. No one says anything about it. It just feels unnecessary, which is made even worse because Pokemon Mansion sucks as a dungeon. This is the only dungeon in the game where I actively think that every room here looks the same, at least in the original games. Plus, the solution to this dungeon is to walk off a ledge that doesn't really look like it leads anywhere, and the hidden switch gimmick is more annoying than it is interesting. Additionally, there are so many fucking poison types here, both in the wild and in trainer battles, meaning that you'll likely get poisoned at least once while you're going through here. The whole ordeal is just tedious, and I'm really not a fan of it. Thankfully, the Cinnabar gym itself is really good. It's the only gym in this game where I actually like the gimmick, which is trivia about Pokemon. Most people will get to this gym later in their runs, the earliest that this gym can be is your 4th one, so they probably know a good bit about the game to be able to answer these questions, or the player is someone like me who's been playing Pokemon for years and knows these games by heart. There are a couple questions that are worded a bit weird, the main one being, does Caterpie evolve into Butterfree, because both yes and no are valid answers. Thankfully, this was fixed in the remake to make the answer much more obvious. The answer is yes, by the way. If you get a question right, you can skip the trainer for that room, but you can still fight them too if you'd like. Blade himself is a pretty standard fire-type trainer, and by this point you probably have a good water, rock, or ground type, so he's probably not going to be too hard. Not as easy as Koga, but still pretty easy overall. Really good gym, probably my favorite in the game. Once you've obtained all 7 badges before this point, you can finally return to Viridian City to enter the gym. While the gym is technically a ground-type gym, it serves more as an all-around gym with trainers carrying lots of different types, such as fighting, poison, grass, and of course ground. There isn't really much of a gimmick here aside from the movement panels from the Rocket Hideout, but I like this gym for serving as more of an endgame test before the final gym leader. That final gym leader being Giovanni. While it may seem like an obvious twist for us in 2024, I really like this twist in story level. Let's talk about Giovanni as a character here. Somehow he got certified as a gym leader before the game even started, only to start a criminal organization that terrorized much of Kanto to the point where the local police force could barely do anything against him, and his motivation is pretty simple. Use Pokemon to get what he wants, whether that be money, power, or something else. He's a simple character in terms of motivation, but you gotta respect his hustle. And then he gets his ass beat by a 10-year-old 3 times in a row. Unlike every other villain in the series, he's the only one who's self-aware and is like, wow, my entire criminal empire has been toppled by a 10-year-old, what the fuck am I doing? And so he just disappears forever after you beat him for the 3rd time. He never returns in this series except for very rare instances, such as the Celebi event in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the Pokemon World Tournament in Black and White 2, and the Rainbow Rocket scenario in Ultra Sun and Moon, all of which are extraneous sources of content in these games that can be ignored pretty easily. Emphasis on can, that doesn't necessarily mean should. He's a really good, albeit simple character, and I can appreciate that a lot. Once you beat Giovanni, you can head toward the Pokemon League for one final battle with your rival before Victory Road. This fight is pretty hard, honestly. Even with how many trainers are present in Kanto to fight before this point, if you're using a team of 6, you'll probably still be under-leveled for this fight, with his lowest Pokemon being 47 and his highest being 53. We'll come back to this later. It's a pretty good fight and a great warm-up before Victory Road. Once you go through the badge check gates, which, side note, are one of my favorite parts of all of these games, up through Gen 6, you finally reach Victory Road, which is just another cave in this game. It's pretty simple, with a couple of strength puzzles and some really strong trainers, and in the original Red and Blue, it's also home to Moltres, the final of the 3 legendary birds, and probably the worst if I'm being honest. There are a lot of good fire types in Gen 1, including Charizard as one of the starters, so by the time you get to Moltres, it's really not that good. Before I talk about the Elite Four and Champion, I want to have a semi-brief talk about the game's balancing, or lack thereof, because that lack of balancing is what makes this generation, specifically Red, Blue, and Yellow, so uniquely different from every other game in the series. There are 2 elephants in the room when it comes to game balancing in Gen 1, those being the Psychic type and the Special Stat. We'll start with the Special Stat first, since understanding that is integral to understanding the problems with the Psychic type. For those who started playing Pokemon after Gen 1, aka Gen 2 onward, the Special Stat is essentially a combination of what would later become Special Attack and Special Offense, meaning that Pokemon in this game both attack and defend with the same stat when it comes to special attacks. The thing with that is, though, prior to Generation 4, all moves were sorted as either physical or special according to their type, with Normal, Fighting, Flying, Poison, Ground, Rock, Ghost, Bug, and later Steel all doing physical damage, while Fire, Water, Grass, Electric, Dragon, Ice, Psychic, and later Dark all do special damage. So, any type of move that's classified as special will do damage based on the Pokemon's special stat, and the damage the opposing Pokemon receives is calculated by their special stat. This essentially means that if a Pokemon has a high special stat, not only can they hit like a tank with special type attacks, but they can also take very little damage from them as well, which leads perfectly into talking about the Psychic type. Psychic is a type based entirely around the special stat in this game, and because of that and its lack of weaknesses, Pokemon with the Psychic type, especially pure Psychic types, are downright overpowered in this generation. Since the Dark type didn't exist in Gen 1, the only attacks that can hit for super effective damage are Bug and Ghost, but both of these have a lot of problems. For Ghosts, there are only 3 Ghost Pokemon in Gen 1, Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, all of which are also Poison type, which is weak to Psychic. Plus, Alakazam, the most common Psychic type in this game, is faster than Gengar and has a slightly higher special stat, and that's without even factoring in that you can't get Gengar without trading, meaning that if you're using Haunter, you'll be outsped by Alakazam, Starmie, Kadabra, tied with Jynx, and of course outsped by Mew and Mewtwo. And on top of that, Ghost is a physical type in this game, yet the Gengar line has pitiful physical attacking stats. Bug has a completely different problem. It sucks. There isn't a single Bug-type move in this game that has a power of over 50, and the strongest Bug-types in this game, Scyther and Pinsir, don't learn a single Bug-type move in Gen 1. With all this combined, Psychic is an objectively overpowered type in these first 3 games. With that being said, however, they are not infallible. Several Psychic types in this game are paired with other types, such as Slowbro and Exeggutor, meaning that you can hit those weaknesses instead. As for the pure Psychic types, the best way to take them out is with a strong physical attacker that either outspeeds them or can tank 1 or 2 hits from them. And guess what Pokemon fits that description? Gyarados is the Psychic type killer in Gen 1, and with access to Hyper Beam, which is a physical attack in these games, it can one-shot almost every Psychic type Pokemon easily. Or any Pokemon, really, but that's Gyarados for you. There are also a lot of glitches in these games that further upset the overall game balance, but I don't really feel qualified to speak on them, and there are smarter people than me who have covered those topics in depth. I personally recommend Ken K's video on Gen 1 where he explains these a lot better. In my experience, these glitches didn't impact my experience too much, but they're definitely omnipresent in a lot of ways. With my game balance overview out of the way, let's finally finish this by talking about the Elite Four and Champion. The final 5-trainer gauntlet of the Indigo Plateau is genuinely a great way to end the game. The big asterisk to a lot of challenges in this game is that at any time you can just leave and go to a Pokemon Center to heal, and that privilege is taken away here, which actually makes this an endurance challenge that can be pretty intense. Sure, you can bring as many full restores and revives as you can afford, but that won't restore your PP, which is the real limiting factor here. You can heal your level 100 Mewtwo as much as you want, but it can't do anything if it's out of PP for Psychic. Lorelei and Bruno are both pretty easy. The former because Ice is a really bad defensive typing, and most of the Ice types in this game are also Water types, so any Electric type move will be enough to destroy her team. And the latter because Bruno's team is shockingly horrible. Like, the only good Pokemon here is Machamp. There's a video online by YouTuber PokePhenomenal where he manages to beat Bruno with every single Pokemon in the Kanto region solo. And yes, that includes Caterpie and even Magikarp. Agatha is where this gauntlet really starts to get hard. She's a Ghost-type trainer who is more of a Ghost and Poison-type trainer. You can say that about all of the Elite Four, actually. Lorelei uses Ice and Water types, Bruno uses Rock and Fighting types, Agatha uses Ghost and Poison types, Lance uses Dragon and Flying types. I really enjoy this, and I wish that later iterations of the Elite Four lean more into this. Since Gen 1 only has one Ghost line and Dragon line respectively, I don't mind that Agatha and Lance use Pokemon outside of their assigned type. In fact, I welcome it. Once you beat Lance, there's only one challenge left before the credits roll: your rival. We'll call him Blue for the rest of this section to make it a bit easier to understand, because I have a lot to say. First, about the fight itself. One thing I haven't mentioned up until this point is that the Elite Four in this game have a significant level spike. In all of Victory Road, there is not a single trainer with a Pokemon over level 50, and the only trainer before this who had a Pokemon above that level was the fight against Blue before Victory Road. Yet, Lorelei's weakest Pokemon is level 54, and Blue's team goes as high as level 63. There is no way to get to that level without grinding. Plus, it just doesn't make sense in my opinion. How the hell did Blue, between the time of your last battle and the Champion battle, manage to not only get through the entirety of Victory Road and beat the Elite Four, but also have the time to grind his Pokemon at such a high level? It's probably the biggest instance of ludonarrative distance in this game, and it's actively very annoying. Wow, I got to use every game critic's favorite term for the first time. Hell yeah, this is epic. With that being said though, I think this also serves as an interesting way of teaching the player that levels don't matter nearly as much as a balanced team with good movesets. In both Fire Red and Leaf Green, I grinded a team until all my Pokemon were level 50, and I was able to beat them relatively easily, although I did have a much tougher time in Fire Red compared to regular Red. I still think it's a really big difficulty spike at the end of the game, but for being the final gauntlet, I mean, I guess it makes sense. The Champion fight itself is easily the hardest fight in the game, and not just because of the level spike. He has an incredibly well-balanced team that, if you aren't steamrolling it with Gyarados like I did in Red, can be really intense to try and work around. If you're playing with a starter that isn't Charmander, Blue even has a Gyarados of his own with Hyper Beam that can absolutely wreck your shit if you don't have an electric move to take care of it quickly. It's a really cool final battle and is honestly one of the best fights in the series. Story-wise, this fight is really cool too. A lot has been said about how good Blue is as a rival, and I think he's great. I don't think he's as much of an asshole as a lot of people online would like to think, but throughout the entire game, he's always one step ahead of you, and he clearly knows a lot more than a first-time player does. There are several fights with him in this game that, if you're not properly prepared, you can lose pretty easily. Because of all this, he can act pretty cocky, and he has the skills to back up that cockiness as well, and all of that culminates in him becoming the champion before you. When you finally beat him, Professor Oak comes in and says that he's disappointed in Blue because he didn't treat his Pokemon with love. I think that's true, but not because Blue is an asshole. I mean, the kid is 10 years old. The most asshole-ish thing he can say is just calling you a butthole. But because I get the impression that he's rushing. He's rushing through the entire Kanto region to catch as many Pokemon as possible, to systematically choose the strongest ones, all to make his grandpa proud and despite us. Oak says at the beginning of the game that you two have been rivals since childhood, and given that this adventure is the first time both of you have been able to go out into the wider world, he wants to prove himself to you, to Oak, and to himself by any means possible. So when he finally becomes champion, finally proving himself to the entire world, and then loses his first battle as champion to you, imagine how soul-crushing that is for him. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, there's a credit sequence after you enter the Hall of Fame where Blue runs away from you and Oak. He's devastated. Honestly, I feel kinda bad for the kid. It doesn't justify him being an arrogant prick, especially in the remakes where they tune that up with some new dialogue from him, but that doesn't invalidate his struggle either. He's easily one of my favorite Pokemon rivals in the series for how well written his character arc is. One that continues in Generation 2, but we'll get to that another time. And that's it. You've become champion of the Pokemon League, the credits roll, and you're placed right in front of your house. What else is there to do? Well, not much. The big thing here is that you finally get access to Cerulean Cave, which is home to some of the highest level Pokemon in the game, including the strongest of them all, Mewtwo, who serves as a great way to end the game. It may seem like Red and Blue don't have a post-game, but they do. Completing the Pokédex is the post-game, exploring areas you've already been to in order to find Pokemon that you've never seen before. Compared to future games, it's not much of a post-game, but for the first entry in the series and it being a Game Boy game, I think that's fine. Real quick, I do want to go over how Fire Red and Leaf Green function as remake, since I went out of my way to play them for this video. I will say that I don't plan on covering the Let's Go game since I don't have a Nintendo Switch capture card at the moment. As for the GBA remakes of Red and Blue, I think these are the best way to play the Kanto region. I don't think they entirely replace the original Red and Blue, since these two sets of games play fundamentally different from each other due to the special stat in Red and Blue, as well as the new balance changes introduced in Gens 2 and 3 being added to Fire Red and Leaf Green, but in terms of how enjoyable they are to play, I think Fire Red and Leaf Green are incredible. There are several small changes in these remakes that I really like. For one, not only is Mankey available before Brock to give players who chose Charmander a fighting chance, but Charmander also gets access to Metal Claw at level 14, which makes it a really good choice to fight Brock with. Additionally, here are some other small changes I like. The panels in the Rocket Hideout are made significantly faster, fixing my only problem with that dungeon. The introduction of the Dark and Steel types fix a lot of balance issues present in the originals. Blue, or I guess Green in these games for some reason, has more dialogue that amps up his cocky attitude. The Sevii Islands are a really cool mid-game side quest after you finish Blaine's gym, and it also serves as a good post-game area to explore. Of course, these versions of Gen 1 also introduce a playable female protagonist as well, which is really nice to have. There are some changes, however, that I'm not a fan of. Some are minor, like changing the ability to enter Saffron City to be activated with a new key item, the T, instead of getting something from the vending machine, and certain TMs being moved around or outright removed. The main example being Earthquake no longer being in Silph Co like in the originals. But there are also some larger changes that I'm not a fan of. For one, the catching tutorial is mandatory in these games, even if you've already caught a Pokemon prior to getting that tutorial. If you go to the Sevii Islands before beating Surge and getting Fly, you are locked into finishing that side quest before you can go back. And worst of all, in my opinion, is locking out evolutions introduced in later generations until you obtain the National Dex. I wanted to use Crobat on my team in Fire Red because Crobat is one of my favorite Pokemon, and yet when my Golbat was set to evolve, the evolution screen came up and then cancelled itself after every single level. It got very annoying very quickly, and the only way to obtain the National Pokedex is if you register 60 Pokemon in the Pokedex, and then beat the Elite Four. I would have preferred if they just pretended like Crobat didn't exist prior to being in the game, rather than cut me every time my Golbat leveled up. But as a whole, the foundation of Generation 3 is much more solid mechanically than the foundation set by Gen 1. So to anyone wanting to experience the first generation of Pokemon, I would recommend playing through Fire Red and Leaf Green, since it's overall the better experience in my opinion. I've been playing Pokemon since I was 7 years old, yet I had never played through Generation 1 until doing so for this video, and I'm genuinely surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Despite all of its mechanical flaws, Pokemon Red and Blue are an incredible set of first games that allow for so much more player freedom than I'm used to from growing up with Gens 4, 5, and 6. And honestly, Fire Red and Leaf Green have become new favorites of mine. I still personally prefer the later generations, but I have a lot more respect for Gen 1 now that I've actually played through it for the first time. Gen 1 simps actually have a point in some areas, though that doesn't mean I agree with the criticisms of later generations, but we'll get to that in another video. At the end of the day, these games are the reason that we have so many incredible games in the series, and so many amazing creatures to play with both in-game and in real life. And regardless of how you feel about them overall, these games deserve respect for crafting such a strong foundation, one that will only get better with its sequel, and I can't wait to talk about that game with you all. With all that being said, my name is Thomas, I've been the Nightly Scrivener, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Hey there, this is my unscripted end card segment that I want to include at the end of each of these videos just because I enjoy getting to talk without a script sometimes. First of all, if you're getting here, thank you for getting all the way to this point in the video. I do want to address a couple things about, like, future schedules and plans and whatnot, so we'll just go on and get into that. Something you probably noticed about this video, if you came from watching the first one, is that this one is only about Gen 1. I originally said that I was going to do a video on Gens 1 and 2 together, and then do a video on 3, 4, and 5, then 6, 7, and then 8 and 9. I still think, like, grouping them together is a good idea, but I didn't want to make another 2-hour-long video, because the whole process of that was so long, and I just wanted to, I figured making a shorter video, would be, a lot better of a viewing experience. I don't know. But, I decided to split it up into multiple videos, because, it allows me to say a lot more in each instance. That's just how I decided to do it. The Gen 2 video will be out, I think, sometime in October. Probably early October, if I had to guess. I have another idea for a video that I want to have out, in September, that it's more of like an experimental idea. We'll see how it goes. I've already recorded some footage for it. I haven't started writing it yet, but I have like a general concept that I want to go for. And we'll see how that works out. We'll see if you guys enjoy, that style of video more, or the style of video of this one and the Shadow of the Erdtree video. Yeah, so in terms of, like, my schedule that I'm wanting to do, I want to have, so this video is obviously coming out in August. I want to have experimental video in September, Gen 2 video in October, another experimental video in November, and then I want to finish off the year with, the Gen 3 video. I will say, however, that schedule is definitely subject to change, considering that I start school, in about 2 weeks. Yeah, it's kind of weird. So, I'll be going back to college. This is my final semester of college, and so I'll definitely be a bit more preoccupied and won't have as much time to work on, these kinds of videos, but I still want to make it a priority, and at the end of the day, I'm confident in my writing abilities and being able to write, relatively fast, so, we'll see how that goes. I will put out updates on my, community tab, and we'll see how that goes, but yeah, as of right now, I think that's all the updates I can really think of. I'll probably put out, like, a general update video, at the end of the year, probably after the Gen 3 video, assuming that my tentative schedule, goes as planned. But yeah, that's about all I have to say for now. Thank you all so much for watching if you got to this point, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.